Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tackling something that literally impacts almost every single American, but honestly, it's pretty fundamentally misunderstood: U.S. Social Security. Let's dive straight into the history and, more importantly, the math behind the impending crisis.
It really all boils down to one incredibly terrifying question. What actually happens when the math runs out? This isn't just some abstract, theoretical debate we can push down the road. We are staring at a massive fiscal cliff, and it's arriving in the early 2030s.
So, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at life before the safety net. Then, the 1935 Roosevelt Compromise. After that, we'll dive into the demographic inversion, check out some decentralized state alternatives, and wrap up with the sovereign path forward.
Okay, let's jump right into part one. Before the safety net, what was life actually like in pre-1935 America?
Well, back then, growing old was a pretty stark reality. If you got too old or too sick to work, your survival basically rested entirely on your family's wealth. And if you didn't have that, your only safety net was the local county poor farm. Literally, bleak, underfunded institutional warehouses. There was absolutely no federal check showing up in the mail. Society back then operated under what we call a multi-generational burden. The whole concept of retirement barely even existed. You just worked until you couldn't. Families had to live together out of sheer necessity, which meant one single economic shock, say a local factory laying people off or a failed crop, could drag 3 whole generations into destitution, all at the exact same time. And then hit the ultimate catalyst, the Great Depression in 1934. Savings completely vanished overnight. Local charities just went broke. Suddenly, over half of America's elderly population was plunged into systemic poverty. This was no longer just an individual failing, it became a massive structural collapse that absolutely demanded a structural solution. Which brings us to Section 2, the 1935 Roosevelt Compromise, and the actual engineering of the social insurance program. So in 1935, FDR signs the Social Security Act. But here's the thing you have to understand. It wasn't designed as welfare. It was engineered specifically as mandatory social insurance, funded directly by FICA payroll taxes. FDR actually had a famous quote about this. He said, "With those taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program." He intentionally wanted workers to feel they had explicitly paid for their own benefits. It was a brilliant psychological move to create a sense of absolute entitlement, essentially bulletproofing the system from future politicians. Now, you really have to look at the math that made this all work. Back in 1945, there was this massive, incredibly sturdy base of 42 workers paying into the system for every single retiree. 42 to 1. It functioned flawlessly because this enormous pool of contributors just completely dwarfed the tiny pool of beneficiaries drawing from it. Think of it like a perfectly shaped, wide-bottomed demographic pyramid. All right, moving on to Section 3, the demographic inversion and the looming 2026 crisis. Fast forward to today. Plummeting birth rates combined with retiring baby boomers have taken that beautiful demographic pyramid and flipped it completely upside down. By 2026, that massive base of 42 workers, it shrinks down to a jarring 2.7 current workers supporting each retiree. Honestly, just 2.7. The math has completely, fundamentally inverted. To really grasp why this is so incredibly dangerous, we have to look at the plumbing of the system. Social Security is strictly a pay-as-you-go setup. The government is not, I repeat, is not storing your FICA taxes in some personal interest-bearing account with your name stamped on it. The money taken from your paycheck right now is immediately handed straight out to current retirees. So fewer workers trying to support more retirees, that creates an inescapable squeeze on both your wallet and the system's overall finances. Let's track how quickly this degrades. We started with that super stable 1945 ratio of 42 to 1. But as we hit 2026, that demographic inversion accelerates severely. And tracking this trajectory leads us to a pretty harsh reality. The Congressional Budget Office actually projects that by roughly 2033 to 2035, the Social Security Trust Fund reserves will be entirely depleted, completely dry. And here is the absolute bottom line reality of what depletion actually means. By law, the system is only allowed to pay out exactly what it collects in real-time payroll taxes. So if Congress does absolutely nothing between now and then, hitting zero reserves automatically triggers an across-the-board benefit slash of 20 to 25% for every single beneficiary. Literally overnight. It's not a political threat. It is just a harsh mathematical certainty. Which leads us to Section 4, decentralized state alternatives, and how mandates are shifting away from Washington.
Recognizing this impending federal gridlock, a bunch of states are actually pioneering their own workarounds right now. The prime example here is the state-mandated auto IRA. States like California and Oregon are stepping in and legally requiring businesses that don't have private plans to automatically enroll their workers into state-vetted Roth IRAs. It's basically a way to force privately managed savings, but entirely at the local level.
Now, impartially looking at this, there are definitely pros and cons. On the plus side, these are fully funded accounts. They generate real market yields, and they're completely insulated from any federal insolvency. But the downsides? Well, tying your retirement to a state mandate creates absolute portability chaos if you ever move across state lines. Plus, it shifts all the direct market volatility risk right onto the individual. And we have to consider wealth disparity. Richer states with robust programs might thrive, while poorer states could just fall further behind.
Let's move into our final section, Part 5, the sovereign path forward and breaking the dependency.
For folks choosing not to rely on the government, the foundation of this sovereign path requires a massive mindset shift. It means you actually treat federal Social Security as a zero-value asset on your personal balance sheet. By completely writing off those government promises, you are assuming complete independence. You're essentially forcing yourself to architect your own fully funded security from the ground up.
So how do people execute this? Well, workers aggressively utilize tax-advantaged vehicles that they actually control. We're talking about maxing out Roth IRAs, solo 401ks, and health savings accounts, or HSAs. Using these tools lets your capital compound in the private market. You're generating wealth that you personally own, completely separate from those pay-as-you-go demographic risks we just talked about.
And if you want a macro-level example of what this looks like structurally, economists often point to the 1980s Chilean model. In that system, workers could effectively opt out of the state system entirely. Instead, they diverted a mandatory percentage of their income into privately managed personal accounts. The absolute crucial distinction here: those accounts became private property that could actually be passed down to heirs, rather than just a state benefit that disappears the moment you pass away. When we put these two paradigms side by side, the contrast is pretty stark. The federal legacy system relies entirely on state custody, it uses pay-as-you-go funding that's completely at the mercy of birth rates, and its nature is fundamentally about wealth redistribution. That carries huge political risk. The sovereign model, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. It's built on private property, it's fully funded, and it focuses on self-directed capital generation, which means incredibly low insolvency risk. Which brings us to the core takeaway of this entire explainer. Look, Social Security was an absolutely brilliant 20th century solution to an industrial-era crisis. But here in the 21st century, relying on an upside-down demographic pyramid for your financial survival is quite simply a math error. The emerging path forward really requires building an uncancelable personal balance sheet and doing it long before that 2033 cliff arrives. So as you look at your own financial preparations, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If your survival at age 70 depends on a vote in the U.S. Congress, you are entirely a client of the state. As that 2033 cliff gets closer and closer every single day, is your future security dependent on a vote, or is it firmly rooted in your own personal balance sheet?